The dugout shelter that the frontier woman had once been mocked for by the entire valley now became the last warmth her children clung to, as a merciless freeze descended and locked the whole frost-hollow basin in its grip, proving that everyone who had ever laughed at her was utterly wrong. The night the cold struck came without slowness, without warning, and certainly not the kind of winter people could later recall with a touch of nostalgia. It poured down like a verdict, spilling from the spine of Granite Ridge before anyone in the scattered cabins along the valley floor could add another stick to their fires. The wind whipped against the log walls hard enough to rattle dishes in the kitchens, and beneath the drooping willows along the dry creek, brittle branches snapped instantly, encased in ice that formed faster than a person could mutter a prayer. But amid that chaos, while every settler family frantically battled the cold with trembling hands and dying flames, a frontier woman named Evelyn Braddock was pulling her 2 children, Jonah and Mira, across the snow-filled yard straight toward the dugout that had been ridiculed all summer long. And what tightened her chest more than any gust was that she was not dragging them there out of eccentric pride or stubborn need to prove herself right. She was pulling them there because the cabin roof had blown open. The cold had pierced through until breathing was impossible, and the only place still holding any fragile warmth for the 3 of them was the dugout everyone had scorned. 1 year before tonight's storm, Evelyn Braddock had stood in her freezing cabin watching her husband, Reed Braddock, fade away in the whiteout storm that had terrified the entire valley. That year's wind had not only extinguished the family's only fire, but also blown away any sense of security a cabin could provide. Reed's death became a wound that every winter cut deeper, and Evelyn knew that unless something changed, Jonah and Mira would eventually share the same fate. In the long, painful months that followed, while sorting through what remained, Evelyn discovered an old notebook from a Swedish immigrant who had lived 2 generations earlier, describing winter earth shelters, the kind of dugout refuges Nordic people had relied on for centuries to survive harsh cold. The idea seized Evelyn like a lifeline. Despite the neighbors' mockery, the repeated taunts, "A woman can't dig a house," or "Braddock's lost her mind," digging in the dirt like an animal, Evelyn began digging the shelter with her own hands. For 3 straight months, under scorching summer sun and chilly autumn nights, she bent over the hillside, hands torn by the shovel, fingernails splitting and bleeding from clawing clay soil, back aching from hauling stones. No one helped, no one believed. But Evelyn did not need their belief. She only needed a place where the wind could not steal the lives of the family she had left. And in that long silence, she believed one thing alone: earth endures, wood betrays. Grief turned into resolve, and that was the one thing no one could take from Evelyn. When the 3 of them slid inside the dugout, Evelyn slammed the door shut and immediately heard the wind howling outside as if trying to tear apart the entire Granite Ridge, a long, deep wail that made the ground beneath their feet vibrate in rhythm. But inside the earth, the dark, warm space appeared exactly as Evelyn had envisioned. Layers of slate and compacted soil she had stacked tier by tier, pressed tight by her bloodied hands over 3 months, forming a thick shell strong enough to block conductive cold. The earthen walls were not warm, but they were stable, the kind of stability the frontier winter rarely granted anyone. At the back of the dugout, the dual ventilation pipes Evelyn had calculated from scraps of knowledge in the Swedish journal worked just as hoped. Heavier cold air sank through the lower vent, while lighter warm air escaped from the higher one, creating a natural circulation based on pressure difference, allowing the shelter to breathe without cold wind reversing in. To the left of the door was the small airlock chamber Evelyn had designed to block direct gusts into the main refuge. The inner space was narrow, but that narrowness caused body heat to accumulate faster, the way snow survivors often huddle together to preserve breath. In the corner, the compacted clay stove Evelyn had built from clay mixed with straw, what she called a long-burn clay forge, radiated slow but steady heat, suited to the enclosed space, avoiding the sudden flare and collapse that had happened in the cabin years ago. Jonah and Mira huddled close to their mother, trembling, and Evelyn felt the cold gradually leave their bodies, as if the earth itself was embracing the children and returning some warmth to them. But to reach this moment, Evelyn had endured more failures than anyone could imagine. The shelter had nearly collapsed twice when moist soil compacted unevenly. The vents had once reversed and filled the chamber with musty air, forcing her to redig everything at a different angle. Each failure reminded her of Reed's ragged breathing that night, and her grip tightened on the shovel, not out of stubbornness, but out of fear of witnessing helplessness again before the unforgiving frontier cold. Now, as the storm overhead roared fiercer than anything Reed had ever faced, Evelyn felt a quiet truth. The earth still stood firm, and perhaps it was the ground itself, not the shaky wooden walls, that was giving the three of them a chance to survive this freezing night. The wind still howled over the dugout roof as Evelyn settled Mira and Jonah against the warmest earthen wall when another sound, weaker but more desperate than the storm, reached them. Frantic then faltering knocks on the wooden door, like hands already nearly numb. Evelyn froze, eyes fixed on the door. Another knock, stronger this time, followed by a trembling voice shredded by the wind. "Evelyn, open the door, please." Evelyn's throat went dry. The voice, though broken by the gale, was instantly recognizable. Reuben Carter, the man who had stood in the middle of the valley fair, laughing uproariously at the sight of her digging, the one who had said, "Braddock's digging a house like a mole when the real cold comes. Let's see how long the dirt holds." Now he stood outside in this freezing night, pounding on the door he had once mocked. Evelyn stepped to the door, hand trembling because she knew that opening it would let the storm rush in. The shelter would lose heat. The children would grow colder. But a third knock came, very faint, like the last of someone's strength. Evelyn pressed her ear to the door and heard thin, choking sobs. A child. "Lydia, she can't breathe anymore." Reuben choked out, his voice shattering in the wind. That moment struck Evelyn hard. She immediately looked at Jonah and Mira, the two children curled together, eyes still red from cold and fear. This shelter had been built for three. She had calculated oxygen, heat, fuel down to the smallest detail. Adding people meant adding more than lives, more breaths, more bodies needing warmth. But outside was a 7-year-old child freezing to death, a child just like Jonah or Mira, a child who bore no blame for adults' ridicule. Reuben, the loud, proud frontier man, now stood at the door like a shadow crushed by the storm. Evelyn could hear the collapse in his breathing, the rugged male pride of the West, strangled by the cold, leaving only a father begging to save his daughter. That pride, which for years had kept him standing tall against the wind, now made it hard for him to even name his fear of losing his child. Inside the shelter, Evelyn felt torn in two. One side, her own children, the safety she had bled to build, the other a small soul fading just steps away. She remembered the night Reed took his last breath, not because the wind was strongest, but because no one arrived in time to help. That feeling of helplessness, watching life slip from someone she loved while her hands could do nothing, was what Evelyn feared more than the cold itself. She looked into Jonah's eyes. The boy said nothing, but his gaze showed he understood. His mother was choosing between risk and doing what was right. And Jonah's small shoulders nodded slightly, a nod from a child who knew that on the frontier, survival sometimes meant not keeping everything but refusing to leave anyone behind. Evelyn unlatched the door. Wind blasted in like a blade, stinging her face, making Mira clutch her mother's coat in fright. Reuben nearly fell inside, clutching Lydia, lips purple, eyes closed, body frighteningly light. He stammered, unable to form words. I'm sorry. I didn't know what else." Evelyn said nothing. It was unnecessary. The storm outside was too great, and inside this shelter, a child's life mattered more than any apology. She pulled the door shut, sealing the gaps the wind had forced open. The shelter built for three now held 5. The narrow space immediately grew thicker, heavier, the breath in the air denser and warmer. This was the first sign of overload, and Evelyn knew that from now on, every decision she made would no longer be only for her own family. But she also knew, tonight, if anything still preserved a shred of humanity amid this killing cold, it was refusing to let anyone die outside the door. The air in the shelter grew heavier the moment Evelyn closed the door, as if the darkness itself knew it now had to share every bit of warmth, every breath, among 5 people. The temperature inside rose very slowly, exactly how an earth shelter worked. The soil did not warm anyone, it only prevented the cold from stealing the last heat. But even though warmth was somewhat preserved, oxygen dropped faster than Evelyn expected. She felt it in her own breathing, deeper, heavier, and in the way Mira pressed her head against her chest as if seeking easier air. This shelter had been designed for 3. Now it was 5. Each person breathed 12 to 20 times a minute. Every exhale turned oxygen into CO2, and in this narrow chamber, it would not take long for that invisible gas to make heads spin. Evelyn glanced at the dual vents, seeing warm air still escaping slowly. But the wind outside was too fierce. If pressure shifted, the shelter would trap stale air. She swallowed hard, keeping her voice calm so no one would sense the growing worry. In the corner, Lydia lay motionless on the thick blanket Evelyn had spread. The girl's hair was matted, her lips so purple the skin seemed to vanish. Jonah and Mira held their breath, waiting for a sign, while Reuben knelt beside his daughter, his rough hands trembling in spasms. That trembling was not from cold, it was fear. Evelyn checked Lydia's breath. Very weak, but present. Will she be all right? Reuben asked, voice raw as if scraped by wind. Evelyn did not answer right away. No words could reassure. Instead, she pulled out the food supplies. Hard rye bread baked from her last flour, a small pouch of deer fat, and a flask of snowmelt she had prepared before the storm. We have to ration, she said, voice steady as if still in control. Each person a small piece of bread. Water only when your throat burns. The fat is for heat, not eating. Jonah understood immediately. Mira nodded slightly, eyes fixed on Lydia. Reuben took his share but did not eat. He stared at the bread, then at his daughter, then at Evelyn. Finally he spoke, each word heavy as stone. My cabin collapsed like straw. The wind snapped the beams like dry twigs. He bowed his head, hair dripping meltwater onto the dirt floor. I should have listened to you. Evelyn did not reply, not because she was angry or blaming, but because no response could be gentle enough for a man breaking apart. The frontier man's pride, the thing Western men relied on to survive, was cracking before her eyes. Reuben Carter had grown up believing that strength, will, and tough hands were enough to conquer any winter. But tonight the storm had stripped that hardness away, leaving only a father holding a child growing colder. I kept thinking, thick logs were enough, Reuben said, voice choking. I kept thinking a man like me didn't need to learn digging. He bit his lip, unable to continue. Evelyn understood. This was not an apology to her. This was a confession to himself, to the ego of a frontier man forced to accept that strength could not defy nature, and that a woman someone he had once seen as not understanding Western life had prepared better than he ever had. In that moment, Evelyn saw two fears tangled in Reuben's eyes, fear of losing his child and fear of admitting he was wrong. The second fear, for the kind of man raised with hammer and axe, was harder to bear than the cold destroying his home. Evelyn broke her own bread in half and gave Reuben the larger piece. Eat. Lydia needs your warmth. Reuben looked up, eyes red, then silently accepted. The hands once hard as steel now softened like wet earth. In the corner, Mira and Jonah watched silently as the big man hunched in his storm-soaked coat, cradling the bluish child. They had never seen Uncle Carter like this, and perhaps Reuben had never seen himself this way either. As the clay stove radiated slow heat, as the air grew stuffier, as darkness thickened, Evelyn looked around the shelter and understood that from now on, survival was no longer just a fight against the cold. It was also a fight against fear, against pride that had once kept people standing but could now kill them if they did not learn to bend and accept rescue. This dugout had been built for 3. Now it held 5 breaths, 5 worries, 5 hopes. And though Evelyn knew full well this would push the shelter to its limits, she also understood. If a storm could bring down a man like Reuben Carter, then her task was to keep everyone else from falling with him. The strained breathing in the shelter had just settled a little when another sound cut in, hard to distinguish between the howling wind and faint knocking from outside. Evelyn tilted her head, listening. Jonah frowned. Mom, someone's at the door. Reuben looked up, stunned as if he couldn't believe anyone else was still alive out there. The knocking came again, this time not frantic but heavy, as if made by someone on the verge of collapse. Evelyn stepped over, cracked the door just a small gap the way she had practiced to limit the wind rushing in. A blast of snow hit her straight in the face, and in that white swirl appeared 3 figures. Dawson Hale, the old doctor from North Cutter Ridge, Maeve, his 15-year-old granddaughter, and a dark-haired boy, Red, the child Evelyn had once seen playing alone on the grassy hill the previous summer. Dawson was barely leaning on the door to stay upright, his white beard coated in ice. Maeve slumped against his arm, her hair frozen into stiff strands, and Red shivered violently, his hands so rigid they seemed to have lost all feeling. "Braddock," Dawson rasped, his breath breaking into fragments from the cold. "Please, the girl, she can't walk anymore." Evelyn looked into Maeve's eyes glazed from hypothermia, eyelids fluttering as if fighting eternal sleep. Red clutched his purple hands to his stomach, his face so pale the features seemed erased. Without another word, Evelyn pulled them inside and slammed the door, blocking the wind that wanted to rip everyone's lungs apart. The moment the door closed, the shelter grew even thicker. Space meant for 3 now held 8 breaths. CO2 began building so fast that Evelyn felt it immediately as a slight ache at the base of her skull, the sign that the air was turning dense and stifling. Dr. Dawson sank down but still tried to keep Maeve upright, his trembling hands gently rubbing her frozen cheek, the motions of a man who had saved dozens through flu seasons and frontier accidents, now fighting the cruelest invisible enemy, the cold. "Get them close to the heat source," Dawson said, voice weak but skills still clear. "Warm from the core. Don't rub the hands. It'll rupture blood vessels." Evelyn followed at once. She added blankets around the clay stove, placed Maeve and Red side by side so they could share warmth. Jonah helped lift Maeve's head. Mira lightly touched Red's hand, her small fingers shaking at the bone-deep cold of the boy. Reuben, though still exhausted beside Lydia, shifted closer, using his large body to block drafts leaking through the doorframe, turning himself into a temporary wall. "Mr. Hale," Evelyn asked, "how much longer could the kids have lasted?" Dawson closed his eyes for a second, calculating between his years as a doctor and the brutal reality of this night. "Without this place," he said slowly, "they wouldn't have made it another hour." That sentence silenced the entire shelter. Evelyn looked around, 8 people crammed into a space no bigger than a corner of a cabin, all relying on something the whole valley had mocked all summer: an earth dugout, an idea once called insane, and now it was the only reason 8 lives still breathed. This was the domino effect of survival. One person preparing exactly what she needed had unintentionally created an anchor for the entire community when disaster struck. If Evelyn had not dug the shelter, Jonah and Mira would not be standing here. Lydia certainly would no longer have her faint breath. Maeve and Red would be lying frozen in the snow on the trail from North Cutter Ridge. Dawson, old and frail, yet still guiding his granddaughter, would have collapsed at the bottom of the slope long ago. Every path in the valley tonight, traced to its end, led back to this dugout, the only thing that had not betrayed them. Dawson placed his weathered hand on the earthen wall, his eyes softening. "Girl, what you built, it saved all of us." Evelyn did not reply. Not because she avoided recognition, but because in that moment her mind was fixed on one thing: 8 people breathing in a shelter built for 3. Oxygen would drop twice as fast. Warmth had to be split 3 ways. Pressure on the earthen ceiling increased with every minute as the wind outside kept piling snow against the hillside. The night was still long, but even as anxiety crept in like darkness, Evelyn realized something she had never considered before. Sometimes one person's action does not just protect themselves, it unintentionally catches souls they never expected to hold. And that not earth or wood was the true foundation of hope tonight. The air in the shelter had barely settled again after Dawson and the 2 children were placed near the clay stove when a dry cracking sound came from the ceiling, like bones snapping in the dark. The entire shelter fell silent. A second crack followed, longer, more trembling, and then small grains of soil began pattering down onto Jonah's shoulder and Maeve's hair. Evelyn jerked her head up. That feeling, the very slow but very deep shifting of the ground, was unmistakable. It was the sign of frost heave, the phenomenon any cold region settler had heard of but few truly understood. When water in the soil froze, it expanded, pushing the entire ground upward like a gigantic wedge. And though the shelter's compacted earth layers were thick enough to resist cold, they could not completely overcome the expanding force of ice pressing from all sides. Outside, the wind was compacting fresh snow against the hillside, snow drawing heat from the soil, water in the soil freezing, and that upward force now pressing directly into the shelter walls. A long, tearing crack ripped through the space, making Mira jolt and burst into tears. Red, though his hands were still numb, curled up in terror. Even Reuben still cradling, Lydia sat up instinctively. Dawson looked up, eyes filled with both knowledge and worry. The walls are under pressure. If the soil keeps expanding. He did not finish the sentence. Evelyn had understood from the first crack. Everything in her instantly shifted from worry to action. She grabbed the oil lamp and shone it along the earthen wall. A thin fracture ran like a black thread, zigzagging along the slate frame. The crack was not deep, yet it was spreading. "Everyone move back," Evelyn said, voice calm but firm enough that no one hesitated. "Jonah, Mira, stay close to me. Maeve, sit closer to the stove. Red, keep your hands inside the blanket. Reuben, help me brace this spot." Reuben came to her side at once, saying nothing, but his eyes made it clear. He trusted Evelyn more than anyone right now. Evelyn touched the wall, feeling the rhythmic vibration from the soil pressure outside. This was the risk she had feared from the moment she started digging, and the reason she had kept spare planks and burlap sacks in the corner. Now it was time to use them. "Frost heave is pushing in," Evelyn said, like a teacher explaining to students while standing in the middle of danger. When water in the soil freezes, it expands. It pushes everything up, rocks, the hillside, the shelter. Reuben nodded hard, lips tight. "So, how do we fight it?" Evelyn bent down and pulled out the materials. Short wooden beams she had pre-cut, empty burlap sacks, and a small barrel of dry gravel. "By giving it a surface to lean against," she answered. "We can't stop the soil from expanding, but we can redistribute the force." She and Reuben stuffed gravel into the sacks, tied them tight, and pressed them against the cracked section. 2 beams were crossed into braces, one end wedged into the floor, the other pressed against the ceiling. Jonah knelt, holding the lamp for his mother, his face serious beyond his years. Mira hugged Red and Maeve tightly, trying not to cry so they would be less afraid. Evelyn drove each brace in with the full force of her body, each hammer blow echoing through the shelter like a heart pounding to keep living. Every time a beam bit into the earth, more dust fell from the ceiling, but the cracking sounds gradually lessened. Dawson watched the scene with deep admiration. "Girl, you know exactly what you're doing." Evelyn did not look up. "I learned from the times the shelter almost collapsed while I was digging it." Another boom sounded somewhere outside, perhaps a large tree felled by the wind. Though the shelter held firm, the children flinched at the noise, the fear of the 3 spreading even to unconscious Lydia, making her breathing quicker. Evelyn turned back, looked at the 8 people crammed into the narrow space, and realized the truth. None of them had enough calm left to comfort themselves. Fear spread fast, like water seeping through a wall. But as the only one who understood this shelter's structure inside and out, Evelyn was also the only one who could turn that fear into something useful. "The shelter is still solid," she said, for the first time raising her voice to drown out the wind. "It was built to withstand this. It has never collapsed before, and it will not collapse tonight." Evelyn's words did not stop the storm or halt the expanding soil, but they made Maeve's eyes less glazed, made Jonah stand straighter, made Mira stop crying, made Dawson place his hand back on his medical bag as if reclaiming his duty. Reuben looked at the crack now hidden behind sacks and braces, then at Evelyn, his eyes lighting with something he had not known hours earlier he could feel for her. Absolute respect. And amid the wind pounding the hillside, amid the ceiling groaning under frost heave pressure, amid the strained breaths of 8 people, Evelyn understood one thing. There are fears we must face not to prove our own strength, but to keep others from weakening. In that moment, the shelter was no longer just refuge. It became the anchor everyone clung to in order to survive the night, and Evelyn Braddock was the one keeping it upright. Just as the braces Evelyn had set stabilized the cracked wall, a different silence, thicker, more dangerous, began enveloping the entire shelter. Not the silence of a paused storm, but the silence of breaths turning rapid and broken. Evelyn felt her own mind spin slightly, as if an invisible band tightened around the base of her skull. That was the sign of worsening air. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own breaths grow heavier, then looked around. Jonah trying deep inhales that brought no relief. Mira gasping like a fish out of water, Red clutching his purple hands to his chest, and Lydia still unconscious, her faint breaths blending into the stagnant air. Dawson, leaning against the clay stove, suddenly swayed, his old eyes clouding, pupils shrinking, as if no longer receiving enough light. Evelyn knew instantly what was happening. The ventilation pipes had been blocked by ice from outside. Tonight's ferocious wind had packed snow into the pipe openings, moisture in the warm exhaust air freezing right at the narrow points, completely sealing the circulation the shelter depended on. Without pressure difference, air could not escape, and therefore fresh air could not enter. In a space designed for 3 but holding 8, every breath had a cost. Oxygen fell, CO2 rose, and the shelter became a sealed box waiting for the moment people collapsed. Reuben, still holding Lydia, tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse and broken. "Braddock, it's hard to breathe." Maeve slumped against Jonah's shoulder, eyes glazing. Evelyn had read about this condition in old notes. It was not the cold that killed fastest in a sealed shelter, it was the air consumed by the people inside it. 10 minutes after the vents clogged, dizziness. 20 minutes, children began crying without sound. 30 minutes, adults started hallucinating. Dawson whispered, "If we can't clear the vents, we won't last half an hour." Half an hour. That number hit Evelyn harder than any gust. She stood up. "I have to reach the vents." No one had time to object. Jonah grabbed her hand. "Mom, it's too cold out there. You'll—" Evelyn placed her hand on her son's cheek, swallowing every fear gripping her chest. "If I don't go, none of us will breathe." She took the small oil lamp, wrapped cloth around it to shield the flame from wind, then crawled into the tunnel leading to the base of the ventilation pipes. The tunnel was so narrow her shoulders scraped both clay walls, the ceiling so low her hair brushed every damp spot. Only a few feet in, she already felt her own breath rebounding hot and oxygen pour against her face, lungs stinging with each beat. But Evelyn did not stop. She had to reach the pipe openings. When her hand touched the pipe wall, she knew what awaited, both openings completely sealed by thick ice. Cold so intense her fingertips stuck to the surface like glued to metal. Evelyn punched hard. The ice vibrated but held. Second time, pain shot through her hand to the bone. Third time, fingernails split and bled, but a small crack appeared. She knew she needed to break the thinnest point to restore pressure difference, then the cold outside air would pull the warm exhaust out and draw fresh air in, opening the lifeline. From inside the shelter, Red's coughs and Mira's sobs reached her, muffled as if from a fading dream. Evelyn clenched her teeth, changed tactics. She used her knuckles to tap fast and steady at the crack. Each tap sent needle-like pain into her marrow, but the crack spread into a spiderweb. Just one more. A sharp snap rang out, clear like a small gunshot. Then the whole ice sheet broke outward. Cold air rushed into the pipe, strong enough to blow out the oil lamp and throw Evelyn backward, her back slamming into the clay. But the moment the freezing air cut into her nose, Evelyn knew she had succeeded. Inside the shelter, all 8 people drew their first deep breath after minutes of wrestling with scarce air. Jonah burst into tears, but this time with sound. Mira collapsed into Maeve's arms and laughed through sobs at being able to breathe again. Dawson pressed a hand to his chest, regaining steady rhythm. Reuben bowed his head to Lydia's hair and whispered something no one heard, perhaps the first thank you of his life. Evelyn crawled out of the tunnel, both hands torn and bleeding into the clay, but her eyes brighter than ever. She drew a new breath, cold, biting, but full of oxygen, and looked at each face coming back to life. In the longest night of Frost Hollow, they had not only beaten the storm, not only hunger or cold, they had just reclaimed their very breath from the brink of silence. And they had done it because one woman dared to crawl into a dark tunnel when every other hope was about to suffocate. The first light appeared not as full dawn, but as a pale streak filtering through the newly cleared ventilation pipe. A dim glow piercing thick snow, like the weak breath of a sky after a brutal beating. It fell across the faces inside the shelter. Gray and cold but still light, the first sign the storm was losing strength. Evelyn stood, her torn hands still throbbing, but she no longer felt the pain clearly. Her mind was fixed only on one thought. It was time to see what remained of Frost Hollow Basin. She pushed the shelter door upward, but the snow cover was so deep The door only opened a few inches before jamming. Reuben, Dawson, and the man from North Cutter Ridge threw their weight together. A crack sounded snow broke. The door swung open, and cold wind rushed in like the storm's final sigh. But the scene before them was not survival, it was a land stripped bare. Frost Hollow Basin was gone. Not entirely, but enough that the place they had lived no longer existed in its former sense. The first cabin they saw, the Cormans, had been completely flattened by the wind. Only a leaning wall left, with a torn curtain fluttering lightly like a marker of lost life. The massive cottonwood stood skeletal, branches snapped clean by ice until they looked like the bones of an extinct giant. The site recalled accounts of the children's blizzard of 1888, when entire prairies were scoured by knife-like cold winds and hundreds of lives fell in hours. Yet in Frost Hollow Basin, the damage seemed even fiercer. They stepped farther. 10 cabins broken. Not merely roofs collapsed, but splintered into sections as if toppled by some enormous beast. The 2 cabins still standing were no longer windproof. Roofs stripped clean, fireplaces cracked open, windows frameless. Even the livestock barns, the sturdiest structures on western homesteads, had been swept away, leaving only a few loose posts poking from the snow like aftershocks of an earthquake. The Black Ridge downburst was not just a storm. It was a slash across the entire valley. Winds had gusted to 70-80 miles per hour. Temperatures had plunged 40 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes, numbers once found only in tragic historical tales, now made real before their eyes. Reuben stood still for a long time. Then his knees buckled. He walked toward where his own cabin had stood. The snow there was shallower, blown clear, revealing the twisted frame like a crushed birdcage. He reached out to touch a broken beam, and his voice broke. "I built it with my own hands." No one answered. No words were gentle enough to soothe, none heavy enough to capture the full loss. Lydia was still carried in Maeve's arms, her small eyes half closed but breathing steadier. Reuben looked at his daughter, then at the home that had been his life. And he cried, not the restrained tears of a frontier man used to enduring, but the raw sobs of a father who had lost both shelter and faith in his own strength. Dawson stood beside Evelyn and muttered. Survivors of the '88 blizzard said. When they stepped out, they no longer recognized their homeland. But this? It's worse. Frost Hollow has been torn off the map. Jonah gripped Evelyn's hand. Mom, where will we live now? Evelyn did not answer at once. The wind brushed her face, light and weary, as if the storm had taken everything except the people still standing. She looked around. A white expanse, no roofs, no trails, no life. But after a few seconds, her gaze changed. This was no longer a question of where to live. It was a question of where to begin again. Frost Hollow Basin had died in the storm, but the people standing here were still alive. And amid that scene of devastation, Evelyn understood. The dugout shelter they had once mocked was the only thing that had preserved a piece of future for a valley just erased by the storm. In the days after Frost Hollow Basin revealed its ravaged form, the survivors, the few who remained, seemed to have only one choice to stay alive: return to Evelyn Braddock's dugout shelter. Built for 3, it now became the survival center for the entire valley. At first, they crowded together, sleeping leaning against one another to conserve heat, sharing sips of water and scraps of rye bread that Evelyn and Reuben scavenged from whatever ruins remained. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, instead of weakening after carrying 8 people through days of storm, Evelyn's shelter stood firm, as stable as the earth had promised her the day she dug it. That gave everyone hope, and soon they worked together. Reuben was the first to rise after his emotional collapse upon seeing his home erased. He wiped his tears, stood before Evelyn, and said in a low but resolute voice, "If you'll allow it, I'll help dig it wider. You saved us. Now it's our turn to do the rest." Maeve, though still weak from the storm, nodded and stood beside him. They began expanding the shelter. Reuben cut salvageable wood into new braces. Maeve and Jonah shoveled earth. Evelyn redesigned the anti-collapse system based on principles she had studied for months. Dawson, the old doctor who had seen countless winter refuge systems in mountain communities, sat nearby and recorded everything in his old medical notebook, the one he used for life-saving knowledge. His handwriting trembled slightly with age, but remained sure. Braddock structure. Optimal emergency dugout model for extreme climates. He detailed how Evelyn used compacted earth, slate layers, natural insulation, dual vents, and wind-blocking airlock. He wrote, "It was not luck that saved us. It was preparation." No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. When news of the disaster spread beyond Frost Hollow Basin, a county survey team was sent in. They descended into the valley, surveying collapsed cabins like relics of a war-torn land. But when they stood before Evelyn's shelter, the team leader paused for a long time. He touched the earthen wall, examined the compacted layers and reinforced framing, then said something that choked the settlers. No structure in the area survived the downburst, except this one. Evelyn did not know how to respond. She only looked down at her cracked hands, the hands that had dug, built, trembled with cold and fear, but never stopped. Dawson handed his notebook to the surveyor, who nodded slowly. "We'll send this up to the county. This technique needs to be standardized." Jonah, standing beside his mother, heard that, and his eyes lit up. He whispered, "Mom, they want to build shelters like yours." Evelyn gently placed a hand on her son's head. "Not like mine, like the thing that saved all of us." And every person in Frost Hollow Basin, from Reuben, who lost his cabin, Maeve, who lost her way home, to the children who had nearly faded from cold, understood that the first shovel Evelyn drove into the ground the previous summer had not just created a shelter. It had created a chance to survive. In American frontier culture, people relied on one another, on skills, on the land. But this storm taught them a greater lesson. Preparation is not fear. Preparation is responsibility. And Evelyn Braddock, the woman the whole valley had once laughed at, was the only one for miles around who had understood that before everyone else. Outside, snow still lay deep, wind still bit. But inside the expanding shelter, the flame of life was being rebuilt, and this time, by an entire community. 1 month after the great storm, as snow gradually retreated and the ground revealed damp brown patches like fresh scars, Frost Hollow Basin had changed beyond recognition. Gone were the hastily built log cabins meant to defy winter. In their place stood 6 new dugout shelters scattered across the valley like lifelines buried in the earth. No one laughed anymore when they saw someone digging a shelter. They asked one another how deep was enough, how to compact earth for best heat retention, and passed around copies of the shelter design Dawson had recorded. Craftsmen, farmers, widowed mothers, all bent to the soil, no longer out of despair, but because they now understood. What had once been dismissed as Evelyn Braddock's crazy idea was the most sustainable survival model the valley had ever known. Evelyn, though still quiet, could not hide the emotion in her eyes when she saw the new shelters completed. People called her the pioneer of earth homes, a title she did not claim, but no one else in the region deserved more. Jonah and Mira ran around the mouth of the old shelter, laughing loudly in the early spring wind, their small feet stamping the ground that had kept them warm through the deadest hours of winter. From a distance, Reuben watched the scene, his heart tightening not from pain but from knowing that without Evelyn, his daughter would not have survived that night. Maeve was helping Dawson carry copies of the shelter design to neighboring areas. Word of Evelyn's structure had spread so far that a state survey team planned to return for deeper study, to see if the model could be applied to other remote regions, where blizzards and cutting winds remained eternal threats. Yet amid all the recognition, Evelyn did not boast about her work. She only stood quietly before the old shelter, placing her hand on the earth layer that had once shuddered under the storm's compression, remembering the moment she broke ice with bare hands to restore oxygen for 8 people. She understood better than anyone that this shelter, the home no one had believed in, had done what countless log cabins could not. It stood when the entire valley crumbled. The survivors now saw the dugout as Frost Hollow's new symbol. Courage lies not in defying the sky's wind, but in preparing before it rises. And that, more than any title, became Evelyn's true legacy. She turned to look at Jonah and Mira, the 2 children trying to line up stones to mark the entrance to our winter house. And a feeling both peaceful and sharp swept through her. Not from painful memory, but from a profound realization. The earth had held her family when the sky could hold no one. On the frontier, For generations, people believed log walls would keep families warm, that hearths and sturdy cabin roofs were all a person needed to survive winter. But Frost Hollow Basin had learned a different lesson, one not from books or legends, but from every handful of soil Evelyn used to build life. She understood, and now the whole valley understood. On the frontier, people believe log walls keep families warm, but only those brave enough to dig into the earth truly know sometimes life lies where others dare not reach.